Okay. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our virtual coffee at Rodeph Sholom. It is January 13th, and we have had many different programs. Today is the first of having an author. The author comes to us direct from Larry Shire because she is his cousin. What I wanted to tell you is we thought Hanukkah was over. We had 8 nights, and then we had a follow-up session, and I told you Hanukkah was over. Well, when you hear what our speaker has to say, you're going to see that Hanukkah continues at Rodeph Sholom, coincidentally. I have her first book, or the first one, Queen of the Jews. Larry was very gracious about donating it to our library. I have it in my hand, and I already have somebody who has asked to borrow it. So as it finishes, we'll be sharing. Now, I met with Judy, and she is fascinating. I'm not going to tell you very much, except to tell you that you're going to learn about women's lives in the Holy Land way back in the 1st century BCE. I'm going to mute you all if you are not already muted. And when Judy is finished, there will be time for questions. So without further ado, I give you Judy Petsonk.
Thank you very much, Carol. The story I'm going to tell you is a story that wasn't told to me when I was a kid learning about the Maccabees. But what I found was that Maccabees struggle, which I thought, was sort of miraculously over in a year or two, went on for 25 years before the Jews were finally free from Syrian rule. And by that time, all the Maccabee brothers had been killed, except for one, Simon, who became high priest of Judea. And he founded a dynasty that ruled an independent nation of Judea for 77 years. It was called the Hasmonean dynasty because Mattathias's ancestor was Hashmon. And at first, when the descendants of the Maccabees were high priests, things were difficult but went well. But then by the grandson's generation, the grandsons decided to make themselves kings as well as high priests, and it didn't work out very well for Judea. Yet by the time I finished my research, I came to feel that the Hasmonean dynasty and that century was the most important century in Jewish history. Why? Next slide. Because Judaism was transformed from here are my 2 books about the Hasmonean dynasty. Judaism was transformed, next slide, from a religion centered in the Holy Temple, consisting of animal sacrifices made by priests, next slide, to almost a different religion, practiced in Jewish homes throughout the world. And next slide, instead of animal sacrifice, the center was study, interpretation, debate, discussion about ethics and the way to live. When historians try to explain such a radical change, they look at 2 factors usually. One is outside influences, such as an invasion or a pandemic. And the second is outstanding personalities who shaped or changed the culture of the period. 400 years before, in the 400 years before the Maccabees, there were 4 major invasions. Next slide. First, the Assyrians, who conquered the northern kingdom of Israel and exiled all the people. Second, the Babylonians, who conquered this, next slide, who conquered the southern kingdom of Judea, but did not exile all the people, only the wealthy and the nobility. And that left the common people to continue practicing Judaism as they understood it. Third, after only 70 years, next came the Persian Empire. And they let the elite go back, those who wanted to. They were very successful in Babylonia, and not all of them wanted to go back. But the ones who went back were allowed to rebuild the temple and to begin offering sacrifices in it again. But there was a catch. The catch was that the priests became tax farmers for Persia. They had to collect the tribute from all the families and towns, and then they could collect as much more as they wanted for themselves, and they did. They became corrupt. It became a very lucrative business to be a priest. And the people resented it. There are passages in the Talmud about priests beating on people to get more out of them. As you can imagine, by the time of the fourth conquest, next slide, which was Alexander the Great, the Greek-speaking Macedonian, there was an increasing gulf between the elite and the common people. And the elite was much resented. During Alexander's conquest, after his conquest, his generals each took a country to rule. So in Egypt was Egyptian speaking, the Demotic language of the time, but it was ruled by the Greek speaking Ptolemies, who founded a dynasty there. And in Syria, there were the Seleucids, who founded a dynasty there. And Judea was between the two. And since they were competing with each other, they were constantly taking Judea away from each other. At the time of the Maccabees, it was Syria who controlled Judea. And I didn't know, but by that time, the priests were so corrupt that a number of them became decircumcised, a very painful operation, because they wanted to look just like the Greek overlords with whom they exercised naked in the gymnasium. Another thing I didn't know about the period was that it was the high priest, Menelaus. The priests were bidding against each other for cash to have the position of high priest. And the Greek-speaking high priest Menelaus suggested to Antiochus the Fourth that he outlaw circumcision and other Jewish practices, and that he bring Greek idols into the temple. So it was an inside job that the Maccabees were rebelling against. All this accumulated resentment led to a movement against the priests and for a different kind of Judaism. That movement was composed at first of scribes, scholars, teachers, and they called themselves sages, and their followers called them sages. But their enemies, who were the supporters of the priests and the king, called them Pharisees, meaning separatists who don't want to integrate into the larger Greek culture. And it was that name that stuck, so that eventually even the Pharisees called themselves Pharisees. What about the personalities of the period? Next slide. Well, I mentioned that the grandsons of Simon the Maccabee declared themselves king. The first king ruled only a year and then died in mysterious circumstances. And his brother, Alexander Jannaeus, became king. You see those crosshatched dark places on the map. Well, Yanai was a great soldier. Those were all places that he conquered. And he was a very, he was very gifted as a soldier, but let's say that he was a disaster for Judea. He was a brutal tyrant. He was a drunk. And because of his fierce temper, he had been exiled as a child from Jerusalem by his father. And he knew nothing about the temple service. So when he came back in, and he had lots of resentment of all the people in Jerusalem, which he had been cut off from. So he would mock the temple service, and people hated him. Next slide. His wife was named Salome Alexandra Sholom Sion. And she, on the contrary, was loved by the people. So when I wrote my first book, one of the things, Queen of the Jews, one of the first things I had to figure out was, how did this pious, gracious, competent woman stay married for 27 years to such a tyrant who, she was a follower of the Pharisees, who mocked and undercut everything she believed in? Well, one of the tricky things was that her brother was the leader of the Pharisees. His name was Shimon ben Shettach. So she was between the two worlds. And I thought maybe the only reason she was able to stay married and alive was that he was away. He fought 27 wars in the 27 years of their marriage. And so it was really she who ran the country of Judea and built the forts and everything else. When I decided that I really wanted to write a book about her, and I'll tell you more about at the end if I have time about how I got to do this, I went back to Israel. Well, I'll tell you right now. I was walking down a street in Jerusalem, and I come to a street sign that says Rehov Shalom Zion HaMalka, the street of the Queen of the Peace of Zion. And I was stunned because I had never heard that there was a Jewish queen of Israel who ruled after her husband's death 9 years on her own. So I wanted to come back and do research for a book about her. But life intervened. I went home and I got married and had to raise 2 kids. And finally, when my daughter was a senior at a Jewish day school, the second half of the senior year, they all trotted off to Israel. And I trotted off for part of the time with them. And I got to see this palace. I didn't look like this because it was a vacation palace near Jericho, and all that was left of it were square holes in the ground, like the square holes you see here. But this is an architect's rendering of what the archaeologists thought the place looked like. When I was there, it was square holes and goats grazing on a desert. Let's have the next slide. So Shimon, her brother, Shimon ben Shettach, was beloved by the writers of the Talmud. They called him the one who brought the crown of learning back to Israel. He started the first Jewish schools, and his students loved him. But next slide. The country was completely divided. There were the Hasmoneans, the descendants of Mattathias, who had become these corrupt kings. And the people who backed them were the Sadducees, the party of the wealthy nobles and priests. And there was the party of the sages, who were called Pharisees by the Sadducees. And there was Sholom Zion trying to negotiate and keep them from killing each other, but it didn't work. Next slide. Our sources for most of the story about the Hasmonean dynasty are Josephus, a Roman Jewish historian who lived about 100 years after the time we're talking about, and the Talmud. In the Babylonian Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud, the Mishnah, Josephus paints a really chilling picture of King Yanai. After their first battle, he took 800 Pharisees in chains back to the country to the Jerusalem, and he sat on his balcony of his palace while he watched them. Excuse me. He watched 800 of them be crucified. And while they were hanging there, dying inch by inch, he had his mercenaries bring in their wives and children and cut the throats of everyone. And he and his prostitutes the camp followers drank toasts. This particular the conflict between Yanai and Shimon ben Shetach had been going on for years. But the trigger in this case was at Sukkot. There was people came from all over the land of Judea to celebrate Sukkot at the temple. And they brought with them the symbols of the holiday, the etrog and the lulav. And while they were all gathered on the Temple Mount, there was a ceremony in those days, because Judea was still very agricultural, of pouring water on the four corners of the altar. You know that at the end of Sukkot, we begin the prayers for rain. And this was a society in which everything depended on those rains coming on time. So instead of pouring the water on the four corners of the altar, as was the tradition, not law, but tradition, he poured the water on his feet and washed his feet. And people were furious at this mockery. And they threw their etrogs at him. And it was a trap. Although non-Jews were not allowed on the Temple Mount, he had stationed his foreign mercenaries at the various exits, and they rushed in and massacred 6,000 pilgrims, among them many of Shimon's students and followers of the Pharisees. Well, that morphed into a war that lasted 6 years, a civil war, and killed 50,000 people. But Shimon ben Shetach was not entirely without blame. There are just numerous incidents in the Talmud of how he just couldn't resist provoking the king, pointing out that the king was ignorant and illiterate, and then he would go into hiding, and his students and followers would get killed. He was, it seems, at least at the start of this time, an arrogant and maybe somewhat impetuous or rigid person. At one point, he hung 80 women as witches. And at another point, he condemned his own son to death on what turned out to be false charges framed by Shimon's enemies. An important, let's go on to the next slide. But there's so many aspects of this story that don't appear in the sources. What was the impact on the country of 27 years of war? What was the impact of the other things that happened after they came back? There was a siege, and that's a whole nother story, which you can read, but it was brutal. And what was the impact on families, on women? What did the women do during this time? And in particular, I was fascinated by the incident in which he condemned his son to death, because I thought, how does any marriage survive that? I wanted to ask his wife, but I couldn't because she was never mentioned in the sources. So fortunately, being a novelist, I could bring her to life. I'd called her Sarah, and I could probe what her life was like, because I knew how the women lived in those days. Women had no legal rights. Sarah would have been married at 12. She would have had a baby by the time she was 13, and she would be struggling to grow up while her husband did the important things of debating in the Sanhedrin. And because the Pharisees were working people, his job was processing flax, a smelly and disgusting trade. And of course, he never took any money for his teaching. So here was this guy who was a leader of Judea among the Pharisees, and under tremendous pressure because he was fighting all the elite of the land. And how did she parent in this situation? How did she make enough living to feed her kid? And it raised a question for me that the sources didn't bother to think about. What happened to her after her son died? How could she stay with her husband? And if she'd left, how could she, as a single woman, manage in a society where single women had no rights, didn't exist, where women had no rights? I am going to read you, I made her the narrator of that part of the story. Her brother, Judah ben Tabai, Shimon's best friend, he narrates the parts about how the system of justice, how those Pharisees tried to define and live by a system of justice and law. But she tells about how it was like to live in that time. And I'm going to read you a part of the first chapter, which is told from Sarah's point of view. But before I do that, I want to tell you how to buy them, the books. They're not very expensive. You can just go to Amazon.com, look under my name, Judy Petsonk, which is up there on the screen, and you will see 4 books, 2 nonfiction and these 2 books of fiction. And you can get it either in paperback or on Kindle. Now I will read you a section from the book. This is Sarah speaking, and this is the prologue. Excuse me. I have noticed that in the stories of our people, there are many tales of great men, but few of these tales tell what it was like to be married to these great men. How did Noah's wife, never mentioned by name, feel about being sealed into a ship for 40 days, along with 2 of every kind of animal? How did Abraham's wife, Sarah, feel when he took her away from their home and then offered to make her part of another man's harem? When Adam lost Eden, who got the blame? Eve. No one asked how she felt when one of her sons murdered the other. My name is Sarah, just like Abraham's wife. I was married to a man who was famous in his time. Some called him a world changer. Perhaps he was. I will tell you what it was like to be married to him. Chapter 1. This takes place in Jerusalem in 114 BCE, and Sarah is speaking. The Almighty spared me from being queen, so I did not have the power on that terrible day to hang my husband. even though I thought he deserved it. What punishment could be more fitting for a man who puts his own son on trial? I raced out through the massive bronze gate of Jerusalem, too late. Yoni was barely 13 years old, yet there he stood just outside the city gate, wrists bound together under the hanging tree. Facing him, a semicircle of benches seating the 22 members of the court. A burly bailiff holding tightly to Yoni's arm. In one shocked moment, my eyes took in the whole scene. Land falling away in a steep cliff behind the hanging tree. The massive stone walls of Jerusalem shining golden in the sunlight. The dangling rope and the old tree itself, silhouetted against a clear blue sky. A breeze teased my son's dark curls. Charging toward Yoni, I screamed, "Untie my son!" Even while my feet propelled me forward, my mind insisted, this cannot be happening. My son, on trial, perhaps to die, on such a beautiful day. Vultures swooped overhead, their coarse barking laughter like a pack of dogs. My husband, Shimon, head of the court, stood at the center of the semicircle of white-robed judges. In front of him was a huge pile of rocks. My father, Tabai, and my brother, Judah, rushed toward Shimon. "Stand aside," shouted Shimon. "You may not interfere when the court is in session." I thought, does Shimon think he is a judge only and not a member of this family, the father of this boy? Darting past the line of judges, I threw myself with hands outstretched against my husband's chest. "Shimon," I cried, "this is your son." Shimon held me at arm's length. Tears streamed down his face. In a cracked voice, he said, "I am the head of the court, Sarah. Painful though it may be, I cannot show partiality to someone who has violated the law, even if the violator is my own son." I shouted, "Your son has violated nothing. It is you. You have violated the duty of a father to defend his son. Instead, you accuse him." Shimon turned and addressed the members of the court. "My son is a disobedient son," he said. "He has been accused by 2 witnesses of raping a married woman and of violating the Sabbath. If the court concurs, he must be stoned and then hung." I beat my fists on Shimon's chest, screaming, "Yoni is innocent. Do you not know your son? Never could he have done this." I ran to Yoni and pulled on his bound wrist, shouting, "I will not let you kill our son. I will take him away where you will never find him." Stepping toward me, Shimon spoke loudly enough for all to hear. "Sarah, wife, it is time that you realize that our son, our only son, is a scoundrel. I have tried to bring him to the right path, but he is no good. He has been indicted by the testimony of 2 witnesses, members of the court. I think we must convict." So you may unmute yourselves, or someone will unmute you, and you can either ask questions, make comments, or disagree with me if you like about my interpretation of things. And but I'm going to start out by asking you a question. Now that you've heard my take on the Maccabees and the Hasmoneans, do you agree that Hanukkah is not over? That the Maccabee era, the Hasmonean era, is still with us and affecting us? So, your turn.
You can raise your hand or you can unmute so we can have some discussion.
Well, if nobody is ready to ask a question or make a disagreement or whatever. Oh,
I'm ready to ask a question. I'm ready, Judy.
Okay.
Judy, hi. It's
Hi.
not related to what you just asked, but one thing you said just got my attention right quick. The folks who were exiled to Babylonia in 500 BCE, you said they were just the wealthy and the intellectuals?
Primarily the elite, yeah. And that was part of why the cumulative effect of real difference between the people who stayed behind and the people who came back.
I never knew that. That was never taught to me in any class that I ever took. I mean, and that's significant. That's major. So then whoever it was who wrote Psalm 137, by the waters of Babylon, that was probably, one of their star poets.
Right. Yeah.
So, okay. So I'm going to pursue that further. That's extremely interesting. So thank you for that.
Well, I will tell you a little story about how I came to see the Sholom Sion's palace. The West Bank, including Jericho, had just been handed back to the Palestinians, and they weren't letting Jews or Israelis in. And yet that was the most complete Hasmonean palace that had been excavated, and I wanted to see it. So I was able to get in touch with an archaeology student who happened to be married to a Palestinian, and she had a pass to go through the checkpoint. So she put me in a taxi. She covered me with a rug down on the floor. We got through the checkpoint, and I got to wander around in this deserted archaeological dig. Now, the progress on the dig had been halted. There were just a few goats nibbling around the edges, and there was a family of I guess, Bedouins who were living in a tent and herding those goats. And the tent was furnished with a car seat. And they offered me tea, and it was amazing. The rest was all sort of red rocks and desert. Okay. Any other questions, comments?
Judy, what year was that you were there doing the research? And that's when you were over with Hope with her
Right,
school.
right.
But what year was that, and how long did you stay?
I think it was. I think it was 2005. I'm trying to remember whether she graduated from Rutgers then or from Solomon Schechter. I think it was 2005.
And you were there for several months?
Well, I was there just for a few weeks. What I discovered was I couldn't find anybody who knew anything about Sholom Sion. There was a rabbinical student who was trying to write a thesis on her and was finding nothing except Josephus and a little bit in the Talmud. I mean, the Talmud loved her, but said almost nothing about her. Josephus said she was basically had too much chutzpah. How did she dare to rule Judea, which a woman should not do? And because she ruled Judea, men forgot how to rule, and that's why the Romans conquered. He said, well, she was very competent, but that she did this was a disaster. And the Talmud says she was so pious that God made it rain every Friday night so that the fields would be too muddy, and she would succeed in her goal of getting the Jews to observe Shabbat without work. So, you have to interpolate between these extremes.
So I see David Goldstein has his hand up. David?
Yes, I was just wondering whether the nonfiction books that you have written cover the same period that your novels do.
No, I've written two nonfiction books. The first one is called The Intermarriage Handbook and a guide for Jews and Christians. And it's about the issues that come up in families with an intermarriage and the relations between parents and kids, the difficulties at the holidays, and the decisions that have to be made about raising the kids. And it's sort of, I used it in workshops, and other rabbis and other professionals used it in workshops for people who were contemplating intermarriage or had children who were intermarried or who were in an intermarriage and suddenly facing questions that hadn't seemed such a problem before. So I did workshops with my co-author, Jim Remsen, around the country about that. The second book was called Taking Judaism Personally. I had participated in the Havurah movement, which was sort of a participatory Judaism led by lay people and taking turns, and the feminist movement, and to some extent in the Baal Teshuvah movement, Baalei Teshuvah, of people returning to more observance than they were raised with. I was raised, as you know, Reform, and never even knew exactly what keeping kosher meant, and just exploring what was the spiritual content of those various searches and how did they fit into the evolution of contemporary Judaism. So it's mostly people's stories of their searches and their finds. So no, there is one book that I'm aware of about that's history, but it's called I think it's called the Maccabee Queen. Let's see. But it, the historians run into the same problem, which is nobody wrote about her to speak of. So what do you have to assume from the evidence? He assumes some things different than me. Both the first Judean king, Judah Aristobulus, the eldest of Simon's grandsons, was married to a woman whose name was Salome, and he died under mysterious circumstances after 1 year of ruling. He had declared himself king, and his queen freed the next brother in line for the throne, which was Yanai, who had been in prison because it was feared that he would try to attempt a coup. And then his wife had the same name. Well, was it the same woman, or was it just coincidence that there were two brothers who married two women named Salome Alexandra? He said, well, it was just coincidence. I said, no, somehow she had to be persuaded. The first Salome Alexandra was 37 when she married Yanai, who was 22. She was 15 years older. So if she was the same woman, then you had to figure out why was she allowed to marry him, because she was a wife, but the only way she could marry him, and for religious purposes, she could marry him to bear a son in her husband's name.
Are you
But
referring to Levirate marriage?
right,
Do you-
but that could only be true if she was a virgin, because a high priest could not be married to a woman who had previously been married. So that opened another line of questioning. I didn't pursue that too hard. But, you know, the gaps in the narrative spawn questions to which I, as a novelist, could pose midrashim, could pose possible stories to answer. So I don't pretend to be a historian. I'm definitely not a historian. I'm not an archaeologist. I'm a woman who said, this is very interesting stuff. How do I weave what I know into something that brings it alive for people? So that's, yeah, Nima.
I wonder why you call the book Justice. You mentioned the Maccabees and the Pharisees. You didn't mention the Sadducees in the title, which would have been really the faction. The faction are Sadducees and Pharisees, but you mentioned Maccabees, so that's kind
Because I thought people would know who the Maccabees were and might not know who the Sadducees were. And I thought most people would know who the Pharisees were. But I called it justice because it really struck me that the Pharisees were taking the raw materials, just like I was, only in their time, and trying to say, what is the system, consistent system of justice that comes out of the materials in the Torah? What, how do you put this all together, and what are the decisions that you make as a decisor based on those laws? And there were, like one of the really, what I thought was a very trivial dispute between the Sadducees and the Pharisees was whether when you pour water from a tainted pitcher, does it make the water, the vessel that you pour it into, treif? And or vice versa. If you pour water from a clean vessel into a treif vessel, does the taint travel up the water into the vessel that was clean? And I could imagine how Shimon's wife would say, "Why are you talking about this? This is trivial." But the differences between the Sadducees and the Pharisees, I think, and this is all based on secondary sources, because I except for the two sources that I mentioned, I think it was primarily a class difference, that the Sadducees were wealthy and had power, and the Pharisees were able to foment a movement which became a movement for purification and living by the law, because the priests to whom a lot of those, it was thought that only the priests had to worry about this stuff. But for the common people to say, we want to go to the mikveh, we want to keep kosher, we want to use kosher dishes, it took a revolution for that to be to come about, that groundswell of commitment among the people. And I think it was not just that Shimon and his associates were charismatic, but also that it was a class struggle, and that gave it the oomph to.
Yeah, I understand. One of the dangers of writing historical novel is the problem of anachronism. Judy
Yes.
has changed so much between now and then. They had the temple in those days. Judaism was practiced differently. And your whole life experience is very much 20th century, 21st century Judaism, rabbinic Judaism. So to put yourself back into a time of the temple and to the time where, they were pouring water at the corners of the Mizbeach, it's just amazing. You really have to put yourself in a very different mindset.
I'm not sure I did it. I'm not sure I succeeded, but I tried. I went on the assumption that some things would the feelings, some kinds of feelings would be the same then as now. That, that Sarah could never forgive her husband for executing their son, and whatever he thought the law was, and however sincere he was, and she couldn't help blaming him and blaming his ego for the fact that he couldn't reconsider this sentence. So I placed myself in those positions and said, how would I react? And yes, the temple was an awesome ritual, but to see it desecrated, was just, I think, devastating to people. And to see the priests acting like businessmen, I think, was also devastating to people. I mean, I definitely say I'm a novelist. I'm intrigued by history, and I try to make the connection. When I was a kid, I read books like he went with Marco Polo, he went with Christopher Columbus, and they were faced with the same problem. But I at least wanted her to go somewhere. For her to go with Christopher Columbus or Marco Polo, or to be there, because I wanted girls and women in the stories. So I don't know, if you read it, I'd love to hear your reactions, because I am a lay person, and I may have, it's highly possible that I've made anachronistic mistakes even while trying not to. Yeah, Jackie, you have your hand up?
Yes, I just wanted to say, I think you've really opened something up for us. I feel like the more you know or start to know, the more you realize you don't know. And it's all very interesting. And I just never thought about it or never questioned it. Why we always learn about the men, we never learn about the women. I'm sure their role was more significant than we realize or ever thought about, but this makes you want to think about it. So I appreciate that you opened this up for us, because I think it's given us a new avenue to kind of think about, and it's important. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie.
Judy,
Yes.
Judy, I'm in awe of you. I can't visualize the amount of research and that you put into this, and the patience, and how you check the authenticity over and over again. You must have tremendous patience just to do the research. And I can't imagine the time that was involved, just the time to do this amount of research. Again, thank you, thank you.
Well, it's scary because there's so much that I had to, that I couldn't find sources for, that I couldn't find documentation for, and I had to imagine. So thank you.
I was thinking about that, Ernie, while you were talking, because it's not in our country. It's not here where, so some of the times, Judy, when you went to Israel, it wasn't like somebody was opening a door for you.
Right.
And that struck me as how difficult. I mean, I know when you went in the taxi, I got that story, but even to know where to go in a foreign country to find the resources. I mean, that was an adventure in itself, I would think.
Yes.
Yeah, like the tomb of the Maccabees. It's not the tomb of the Maccabees. I was there, and there's no evidence that it was the tomb of the Maccabees. But yeah, but then there were clues that would come up. Like when I went to Sholom Sion's palace, there were two of everything. There were two swimming pools. There were two eating, courtyards. And it suddenly hit me. She had these sons who were fighting with each other. And she was trying to placate them by giving them identical palaces. It didn't work. As soon as she was dead, they were at war, you know. But just so there would be clues that I didn't expect, you know, that could suggest things.
You really had to be a detective.
Well, I had to be a detective and an imaginer, but you know, I used to be a reporter, newspaper reporter, and I tried to put it together like these, what are these, what ties these incidents that survive together? And of course, they're not all in the book, but for example, when Shimon hung the 80 women as witches, in my book, there are only 8. I figured I allowed for historical exaggeration, but what could have been the motive for that? You know, what triggered that? And I thought, oh, well, who would these women have been? Maybe they were healers. Maybe they were, you know, he thought they were witches. Maybe they were giving herbs to women to prevent pregnancy, you know, because there were such herbs. And if he and his wife were fighting about her, you know, whether she was going to get pregnant again, that would have been that might have been a trigger. So that was way out there, but I was trying to figure out, because the Torah, I mean, the sources say that there was a connection, that it was people who were relatives of the women who were hung, who framed his son. Why would they do that? What, you know, what was the connection? So it was things like that. And, you know, you could put things together and get them wrong, but you can put them together and make a plausible story. And that's what I tried to do, you know, a story that would hold together emotionally and make sense, you know.
I have one more question, unless anybody else has one. From start to finish, do you have any idea how long it really took you with your research, writing?
Finished.
In 4 minutes.
How it took 7 years, but I have to say that not all of that was research, and the research was intermittent. You know, all of a sudden I had to figure out how were they dressed, because I didn't know that from my trip to Israel or the sources, and so that would be a little line of research. What were they eating for meals? But I was raising 2 kids, and even though when I actually started the writing, I was they were pretty big. You know, one was a senior in high school and one was a freshman in high school, but they still took a lot of energy, and I was not what I would say a full-time writer. You know, I was always getting involved with other things, dealing with my son's school and, you know, all of that stuff, and avoiding doing the cleaning and, you know, that kind of stuff.
Anybody else? Well, on behalf of Rodeph Sholom, I want to thank you immensely for coming on, for doing this, for telling us about your book, Justice, Maccabees and Pharisees. And I suspect that some of our people will read it, and you probably will hear from them, because they can reach Larry to reach
Right.
you.
And Larry has my email.
Actually, so do I. So this was very exciting. We've never had an author, and you are first for us. So Larry, I want to thank you for this.
Thank you, Larry.
You deserve thanks for the intro.
My pleasure, Judy. I mean, when we did, Judy did one for family and friends. What was that, about a month ago, roughly?
Yeah,
Maybe a little,
yeah.
yeah.
November.
And then it planted the idea in my head, because we've been doing these coffee and conversations on every other Wednesday for, I guess, a few months. And I said, wow, what a great connection that could be. So my pleasure, Judy. Thank you so much for being able to do it.
Well, thank you, Carol, Larry, and Rodeph Sholom. You were so welcoming.
Well, it was a
And
pleasure.
I don't know if Dorothy is still on, but if you are, I would love to hear whether one of the things I thought is that this is an era that's significant for Christians as well as Jews, because the Pharisee world, the world that the Pharisees created in that century, was the world Jesus grew up in. And the model that he used of teacher and disciples, students, was the model that the Pharisees created, that there would be an authority outside the priests and the temple, and they could learn from that.
So it sounds like, Dottie, you're going to have an assignment to read the
Yeah.
book.
Oh,
Yeah,
she is a friend.
Yeah.
so yeah, Debbie.
I just want to, on behalf of the congregation, say thank you. I have to leave now. This has been wonderful. And as Carol said, our first time having an author on one of these coffee and conversations, which just have taken on a life of their own. So I thank you so much. We as you can tell, we enjoyed it, and we're used to going an hour. So we kind of,
Yeah, we're done.
so I kind of have something else, but I just want to thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you.
Thank
Talk
you,
to you soon,
Carol
Judy.
and Judy.
Okay.
Yeah.
It was
So
great.
Carol, this was recorded, right? So that, because I had to leave in the middle of it. So I missed a lot of what this good program was. So I'm sorry. I hope it was
It
recorded
was
so I can.
recorded. Nima is recording it, and if I do it right, it's going to be recorded by me also, but Nima is the expert.
Oh,
You'll
wonderful.
send
Thank
out the
you.
links for that, either Carol or Nima. You'll send
Yeah,
out the link.
I'll
Okay.
send it out. Yes.
Thank you. Thank
Okay,
you.
good.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. You have a lot of courage and perseverance.
Thank you.
Great talent.
Thank you.
Enjoyed
Bye,
it.
everybody.
Be well, everybody, right?
Well.
Yeah.